Okay, well, we're going to get started, and I would like to introduce Reverend Kanjin Cederman of the Seattle Enkyoji Buddhist Temple and the Jisokai Aikido Dojo. Kanjin Sensei, onegaishimasu.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to be here. Actually, the reason why I don't mind, to have this conversation with people, just as was being said before, this is really an essential part of our practice of Aikido. And, I had spent many years, coming from a Western mind, even though we may be able to have the opportunity to go to Japan and study even amongst some of the spiritual traditions. I believe it takes a very long time to kind of fuse the two of them and to kind of be a conduit of the East and West together, and then to be able to explain it to other people. And that's been one of the things that I've focused on, because sometimes when we look at the spiritual aspect of Aikido, I've heard two parts of it where people write it off, that Sensei was in this magical realm, and that all his students couldn't comprehend or understand him, and he was in his own little world, and that aspect has been lost, they feel. And then the second is people trying to interpret it through a modern lens or a Western concept, or as I said, even for modern Japanese, for them to look at it is completely sometimes foreign. So a lot of times, sometimes they're guessing and trying to recreate based on their concept or their understanding what they perceive these spiritual practices or concepts to be, and then try to incorporate them. Because there's a lot of us practicing Aikido. I'm sure we've seen the many videos of Ueshiba Sensei doing kind of oharai or purification movements with a fan or a spear or a stick or jo or any of those kind of things. And people wondering, well, what does that mean? What's the purpose of that? How does it link to Aikido? And then also the main issue of why people practice Aikido. Most people came to Aikido because they saw a action movie, that they thought Aikido was a very wonderful, powerful self-defense practice. However, one of the things that I've experienced in doing Aikido for so long is I wanted to try to become, or try to be of some use as a conduit, because of my spiritual practice as well as a Buddhist priest, and studying many of the traditions, but trying to bring a holistic understanding of Aikido within a modern person, if that makes any sense. So as a modern person, being able to, first of all, see perhaps the misconceptions and some of the limitations that we have at looking at what the founder had tried to share with us. And then also, as we see now, when Aikido first started, it kind of looked like it was created in a vacuum, that this was just one man's conceptual or spiritual awakening, whereas we know it is this very long connection between many arts, many practices, and many experiences that made up this man called Ueshiba Sensei. So one of the important things I wanted to share is a kind of disclaimer when we start, and this is where the beginning pitfalls happen. First of all, we look at things from a very Western mind. What does a Western mind mean? Well, a Western mind is very based in a kind of materialistic mind. It's based in materialism. So we think that the power of being able to see something, being able to prove something, the concept of science, the concept of intellect is very much a priority in our culture. And also not only in our culture, because we may say, well, in Japan, they think a different way, but in a modern culture, because even Japan now is a modernized society. And I even see that in my practice of Buddhism. There is a big difference between modern Buddhism, which would be after Meiji, which is the modernization of Japan, and pre-Buddhism, before the modernization of Japan. which again changed many things. And just to give you some insight into what that means. So prior to the Meiji Restoration in Japan, Buddhism or any spiritual art, any discipline was taught directly through a master or through a teacher. And that teacher would impart some particular skill or particular understanding or experiential practice to their disciple. And this would be a one-on-one transmission. Buddhism also was taught this way. So a person would take tokudo or kind of, what would you, ordination within a temple under a teacher for many years, study. And then many people did not fully become ordained because that was controlled by the state, because that actually was a position of authority. So many of the great teachers you think about weren't actually fully ordained. They were partially ordained as what we would call today novice practitioners or novice priests. But after the Meiji period, after the Meiji Restoration, they removed those kind of traditions that then they brought in the Western concept of university. So what was at one time a transmission from teacher to student then became something that was taught in the university. So now even to become, which again, if you look at in the West, if to become a priest in the West, you go to the university, you have a master's in theology or a doctorate in theology, and then you become a priest or a clergy member in the Western practice. That then was transposed into Asia. So therefore, most people went to the university to then become a priest, same as in many of the Judeo-Christian practices in the West. What that actually changed was many things, actually. First of all, Japan at that time also removed a lot of what they considered superstitious or outdated practices or understanding and in favor for more Western concepts, such as even medicine. We see that, whereas even the practice of medicine was very much a spiritual practice. Priests would also be doctors as well as spiritual practitioners, spiritual teachers. And then also we have the shift from the Eastern medicine to the Western medicine in Japan. And with that, a lot of basics or basis for the basic thinking at that time was removed and then was not transmitted into modern thought, because the main difference between the ancient and the modern was, in the modern concept, we think that thinking is the most powerful way of perceiving the world, by our thinking, by our philosophy, by our belief system. But actually, in the ancient world, many people were not educated. They didn't know how to read. Also, they didn't have such big institutions to educate people. So they had more of the focusing on the tamashi, or the soul, or the spirit. There's a really great lecture by a Shugenja, which is a Yamabushi, a practitioner of kind of animism and Buddhism mixed together in Japan. And he basically said that the ancient practices of Japan was based on the spirit and also nurturing the spirit, and that one would react through an emotional reaction. And that a fully rounded person, or a sage, how do you say, like a sage, or as they say in Confucianism, the three levels of people, the highest level person was somebody who had come to terms with their emotional or spiritual aspect of their life rather than their intellect. So the intellect, he said, was actually quite shallow according to their ideas, because you cannot even think what you will, if you map out your day for tomorrow, you cannot see into the future. And even if you try to map out your life into the future, no one is successful at mapping it out perfectly, because it has to change, because our mind can't perceive these really big concepts. So therefore they relied more on the spiritual aspect or the emotional aspect rather than the intellectual aspect. And if we approach the esoteric practices or spiritual practices of Aikido with, first of all, our modern conceptions based on our idea of thinking, and we try to rationalize or understand it, that's actually missing the concept 100%. Also, there is a basis of society at that time that was the basis for most practices. So for Buddhism, for pretty much everything, the way of life, based on the idea of yin and yang, or yin and yo, Gogyo, the 5 elements, the idea of the relationship between heaven, earth, and man, which we can see in all the different aspects of the ancient arts. So even if you look at Ikebana, flower arranging, it has to do with those 3 concepts. And of course, in Aikido, we have the concept of Sangen, of the 3 shapes, which I'll speak of later. And so when we are looking at and even reading perhaps some of the poems by the founder, many people try to think through the concept of what he's meaning. And again, that then makes this really big disconnection of how do you implement that in your life? And I believe that in order to implement and understand the true meaning of Aikido and the true power of Aikido, we have to understand some very basic concepts and then be able to integrate them into our life. So Aikido is a worldview, which is quite different than the modern worldview. It actually comes against it, very much so. And again, this is the old coming into conflict with the new. And why is that? Because everything around us has been built on a particular concept based on particular beliefs, particular philosophies, education, etc. But what is the inherent nature of Aikido? It's very hard to grasp. And this is why I think, like, even when I teach Buddhism, in order for people to grasp Buddhism, if you come from a Western point, a Western stance, a modern stance, it's very difficult to comprehend the practice of Buddhism. Because I believe that it is people, and this sounds very cliche, but a way of life, in the idea that there is a way of looking at life that is quite different than the modern way of looking at things. So with that being said, I want to read something just to start the conversation and then to go into the particulars I wanted to share with you. There is a book called The Heart of Aikido, which is actually originally edited by Hideo Takahashi, and this was compiled and translated by Sensei John Stevens. And this is very fascinating. And when you, in ancient times, when you read a book, anybody who read a spiritual book had a basic education in certain teachings that were just part of the culture, such as Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and even Vedism, because a lot of the basics of all of them, which I'll show with the meditation, comes from very ancient teachings in the Ayurvedic and Vedic traditions, because India influenced all of the, through Buddhism, all of those countries. That's why even in Japan, when you think about why you sit on the floor, why they sleep on the floor, why they don't put their head towards the north, people will trace that back to China, but actually that traces all the way back to India. And basically, it is a way of health. That's why I shared this as the way of health and wellness. And so I'm going to read something from this book here, which is just a small part of what Osensei, the founder, was explaining. Now, if you read this book again, if you just read it with the modern context, you'll probably read through it and go, that was a nice book. And Sensei probably had a lot of wonderful things to say. And you may think, again, with your brain, oh, I can buy that. I understand that. But then again, you're missing an entire, there are many layers that can change your life. And so I'm going to read here. It's on page 34. And he talks to them, he goes, However, even the wisest of sages or the holiest of saints cannot precisely describe this reality. Again, this is challenging the idea of being able to put things into words, into thoughts, into ideas. He says, who can explain it in words? How then this fellow Ueshiba able to understand it? Every day I practice to liberate myself from entanglements and confusion of the spirit. Training thus, I was able to perceive the golden aura of my body. On occasion, a fiery nimbus like the one surrounding Fudo-myo engulfed my being with a great light. On other occasions, I saw myself as Kanon Bosatsu. As this person, Ueshiba, I asked myself deep questions. I realized that the universe was within me. Since I was the universe, there was no longer a petty little me. But at the same time, there is only me in this universe. Aikido is different from all previous martial arts. Its sole purpose is to experience universal truth in one's own body and spirit. I ask you to explore the spiritual dimensions of Aikido. Again, that is usually the kind of cliche that people say when they talk about, if you ask any of Sensei's students, that they were quite young and also they were from a different generation. So when Sensei spoke, they didn't have the context. So they always talk about the magic smoke. And again, he says the aura around him, and they kind of perhaps zoned off. Because even at that time, when they were being taught, that level of conceptual, that level of awareness or thinking or philosophical belief or spiritual belief was changing for a more intellectual mindset of the modern age. And it's very interesting because we can see it demonstrated. So we know that Aikido has this power that is different than other martial arts. And it was really interesting because, you know, I think Aikido has a kind of, which we're all trying to figure out, has a kind of identity crisis where on the outside, it looks like it's a very physical form of self-defense, right? Especially if you watch any of the how do you say, Hollywood movies, right? But again, it's more than that, because when you put it into the concept of a lot of the other traditions like jiu-jitsu, etc., then many people try to make it into a simple self-defense, a practice of self-defense, and kind of remove the spiritual aspect. And what actually I saw in a conversation, it wasn't too long ago, and many people who were practicing Aikido were actually saying, well, they were comparing it with Koryu, older styles of practicing, which are very regulated styles of practice. So when you pass it from one person to another, you pass it exactly. And you practice it very exactly. Where Aikido has this very natural, formless movement that makes it really hard to understand, rather than something that is like kata-based or form-based. And a lot of people were saying, kind of in a way downing Aikido, saying, well, you know, we're a young art, and that we are, you know, trying to be able to share the effectiveness of Aikido. And actually, one sensei who had practiced Aikido, but actually he also is a Koryu sensei, so he understands both sides. You might know him, Ellis Amder sensei. He said, actually, I think Aikido is one of those extremely rare arts. And he gave an example that my daughter, for instance, and people, children through Josh Gold sensei, were actually creating a Aikido dojo as part of a youth, how do you say, study group, and what is it called? A leadership program, to create a dojo, Aikido dojo in Africa, in Ethiopia, and to have it becoming self-sustaining by making a coffee field and being able to sell the coffee. So they took time to distribute the coffee. They all took different parts. And Alice said, Amdo Sensei said, what he saw was that in Africa or that area of Ethiopia, there were many tribes. And usually they never come together. They have very different languages, different cultures, different beliefs, etc. But in this Aikido dojo, they all came together. And this power of unity that went beyond the concept of words, the concept of culture, religion, belief, all of that, they were brought together in this very harmonious practice of Aikido. And he said that specifically Koryu could never do that. Koryu would not be able to do that. But because of the fluidity and nature and essence of Aikido, it had this power to bring people together in a very positive, interaction, even though their language may differ in that. I thought that was really important because people are always thinking about the self-defense effectiveness of Aikido, but actually, as we know, anyone who has studied long enough, that the self-defense starts with oneself and one's perception, one's outlook, one's awareness. That is very essential, not just how tough you are, right? Or how skilled you are, but actually a mentality that comes with it. So with the concepts, what I want to share is some basics. So again, we can't share everything in 2 hours this week or next week, but I wanted to give people a kind of insight, because it can be very daunting if you have the proclivity to really understand the spiritual aspect of Aikido. So first of all, when you look at the concepts, as I was speaking of, Yin-Yo or Yin and Yang, the 5 elements, all of those things that build into this mindset to understand, because most of the time that Sensei is talking about, he's talking in those ancient terms. And if you don't understand, and each of these systems are a way of perceiving the world, a worldview. And to be able to have the worldview to see the world differently is kind of challenging for us, because even as we know, when people look at something as like Chinese medicine, they talk about different organs, the same organs that we actually have physically in our body. But actually, we would, in our Western mentality, get stuck on there are physical organs, but actually they're energy. So it's a whole different way of speaking. And that's why when you use English or Western, Latin words or Greek-based words, they don't have the same concept, because it's based on a different system of belief. So when you may do your own study about these basic concepts, to then bring them together, because sometimes they feel very disjointed. That was one of the problems that I had when I was studying it. There are so many different systems. So sometimes they don't always seem to match. But the underlying understanding, again, that's where we're getting stuck in our thinking. We're like, okay, this doesn't match with this. Why? Which one is right? We're having these kinds of discussions. So a lot of people just give up. But the idea is not about being right. What it is the basic concept that is under all of them, and that actually person would simply use one of the systems. Now, there are systems that are more common than other ones. So how to view the idea of yin and yang. There were many hundreds of different schools, perhaps thousands of different schools in China under that concept. Also, the idea of interpretation of the elements, the 5 elements. We have the Vedic concept and the Chinese concept. So you would see, okay, they're different. So they seem opposing. But actually, what it allows us to do is that it's a different way of perceiving the world. And again, this comes down to the idea of energy. So I wanted to share that. Well, you may ask, what? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I interrupt you to
Sure.
ask if people have questions, would you like them to put it in the chat, or would you like them to just ask you, or wait till the
Yeah,
end?
they could just ask, since we have just a few people. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people, please feel free to chime in if you have questions about something.
And one of the things is that as compared to when you look at something materialistic, and this is where the concept comes in of how we view things. When you have this mentality, everything in the East, especially based on this idea of Vedism or Taoism, is incorporated into everything, even the hakama we wear. There was an argument online that, the 5 pleats in the front of the hakama, somebody uses the 5 principles of Confucianism. And then somebody wrote, well, that is, that is under debate. It's not about debate. It was the idea of seeing the divine within everything. So it's not necessarily that philosophy that somebody, when they made hakama, specifically made it with that concept. But again, actually, most of the time they did, because that was the worldview. So even the idea of the coin, so everyone has seen the goen, the 5 cents in Japan. This is actually a older Chinese version that they use. In Aikido, we have the 3 symbols, which are very important, right? We see them all the time on the Aikido, in the Aikido dojo. And what are they? They're the circle, triangle, and square. Those concepts are into everything. So even this idea of this coin, you see this coin, the idea of the heaven, which is seen as the circle, as the canopy of the world, is the outer side. And then the inner side, the square, is seen as the earth. And that is the center, because that's showing, and you might have seen the diagram of Ueshiba Sensei with the square with all of these, like it looks like for Hapo-Ondo. That's the idea of the directions of the earth, which is in the concept of the square. We use that constantly in Aikido. And then the idea of the harmonious connection between the 2 of them. This is the concept made into everything. How one ate, how one slept, how one drank, how they made the coins. Why? Because in one's ability to express spirituality, they consider that a level of mental and physical health. So we sometimes don't connect the 2 of them. We know the kind of cliche saying of healthy body, mind, spirit. But what does that actually mean? In a Eastern concept, that meant in that every moment of one's life, they used an if the world itself, because as we know, the 3 of them, the triangle, which is missing from here, is man. That is the connection between the heaven and the earth. And that in that connection, we have a very essential aspect of why we exist. So in the Ueshiba Sensei talks about many times the idea of the floating bridge between the world and the spiritual world. This, of course, is a symbolism from Shintoism. But this idea of musubi, or connection, we're an essential component of that. So as in the Western concept, where man is seen as separate, or nature is seen as separate, they're all seen as a dynamic, interconnected, and actually essential part of life. So whatever we do, or how we are in balance or out of balance, has a direct effect on the state of the world, our state of the world, the state of others, health and wellness. And that when we're in this harmonious concept of being able to connect the 2, and we're an essential aspect of that. Whereas in many traditions, man is seen as the problem, because that's seen as the ignorant man, or through ignorance we cause suffering. But through awareness, we can actually bring harmony between all of the elements and others. And again, this is a very different perception, a very different life viewing, a life view on life, I would say. And without going too far into it, with the concept of yin and yang, that is where man meets and connects both heaven and earth. So even though I spiritually may say I'm between heaven and earth, as we think in Tenshinage, that actually it's true. But in order for me to comprehend that and, how do you say, exemplify and experientially teach that or understand it, I have to have a certain awareness about that connection. So that awareness is what we consider to be awakening and enlightenment in Buddhism, the subtle awareness. So it's not a knowledge, it's a subtle awareness of our interconnectedness of all things. And Ueshiba Sensei was feeling that and wanted Aikido to be an expression of this, a natural expression of this kind of creation, but also understanding the role that we have in our life with the world, the elements, yin and yang, cause and effect, and everything. So by the perfection of the being, and that perfection being that awareness, we were able to bring into harmony. And that's the true concept of health in ancient teachings, because through that correct regulation of one's body, correct regulation of one's breathing, correct regulation of one's awareness, and I didn't say thinking or understanding, I said awareness, is manifested in one's life. So Aikido was seen as a way to mental and physical and of course spiritual health. And I think that aspect is quite understated in the modern terms, because I don't think a lot of people have had the basis in order to bring people through each step. So with that being said, if you have any questions, then we'll go into, I wanted to teach a form of Shikam meditation, and that is concentrating and seeing, which is actually the basis for very heavily influenced pretty much every form of meditation in the countries such as Korea and Japan, and even in the Shinto traditions as well. So I wanted to share that practice of meditation. But before we continue, do you have any questions? So I appreciate, I'm, this is a very difficult concept because there's not too much written on it, or people haven't really tried to share it. So I'm working through trying to be able to share what took me a long time of putting together, and frustrated, and then having all of these disjointed parts and then seeing how they fit together.
Kanjin Sensei, I don't necessarily have a question, but just a reflection on what you said about how sometimes it's difficult for people to bring together the practical or materialistic aspect of something with the energetic aspect of it. And you mentioned Chinese medicine, and
Yeah.
I practice Chinese medicine, and I have given up on telling patients you have a spleen, your diagnosis is spleen qi deficiency, because 90% of them go, oh my God, there's something wrong with my spleen. And then it turns into a big mess. So I get what you're saying about that so much.
Well, even the concept of ki, right? Because we had all of these books come out about ki, that people were trying to get more ki or less ki or whatever, or in between, or and that ki was seen as, again, if I was a materialist, I would think, all right, ki means getting more ki, and then I have more ki than you. But as you know, in the medicine, the idea is not about more or less. You can't do that. The idea is movement, the ability to not be obstructed and to move. I believe that's what Ueshiba Sensei was trying to teach us. And again, one of the interesting aspects that even relates back to Buddhism. So Buddha existed 2,500 years ago, probably more than that. So about 3,000 years ago. And he knew that every 1,000 years after he passed away, the teaching would change, and that we would come kind of further away from these kind of, how do you say, basic concepts of reality. Because we, of course, we have wonderful modernization of things, technology, but in a way that kind of removes our common sense. That's why now in Japan, people are so interested in Shugendo, because it's basically just going into the mountains. And in the mountains, none of that stuff works. Even your cell phone doesn't work, right? And if you're in the mountains long enough, there's no place to plug it in, unless you bring one of those little solar things. But again, the concept being that everything we hold as dear and important in the modern mindset is kind of useless on the mountain, because you have to, your true nature comes out, your core nature comes out and is shown, and then nature kind of works with that in a kind of how do you say it, natural way. Because even if we look at, next time I'm going to show the idea of creation within Aikido is seen as kind of a rebirth, and that every moment through our actions, we're either in the harmony, because that's the idea of a sage. So in the three types of people, so I want to bring in just some different aspects of different teachings, because so people can get an idea of, you know, how they all work together, because we see them as separate. So people think, okay, this is Buddhism, this is Taoism, this is Confucianism, and they're all kind of separate. But in actuality, it's not about holding on to a philosophy or holding on to, again, a materialistic thing. It's about an intrinsic internal understanding. So when we talk about those three aspects of heaven, earth, and humans, this is one of the central thought or concepts in Chinese thought, but also it's exemplified in Taoism, but it actually, you can be found in Vedism as well. And this is, of course, the relationship between heaven, earth, and humans. And of course, the link between both of them is this concept of yin and yang, yin and yo, which moves between heaven and earth and affects the landscape and can be interacted with by humans. So what is the influence that humans have to the natural environment? In the old concept, we have that through our understanding of yin yo, because that's how we view the world. Actually, there is no yin yo, because they have, if you look at the circle, the idea that they incorporate each. And again, the way that the old characters of yin and yo are simply the idea of the sun rising up on a hill, and where the sun is at its highest point and where the shadow is. And those are the concept of what is warm and cold. But they're not seen as dualistic. They're seen as one of the sense, but how they interact with each other. And again, this is energy. A good example of the relationship is that of planting crops. Humans plant crops in the earth, but it takes time, the heavens to nourish them so they can grow from the rain. Humans then harvest, and the waste degrades and replenishes the earth. All three of these are needed in order for the human existence. But that's also the natural existence. While heaven cannot be altered, because heaven is seen as space and time, the land should be properly cultivated, and humans should aspire for perfection. And that perfection is not in one's thought, but in one's relationship to earth, which is what we directly influence. And that should aspire for perfection, both within themselves and within the landscape. So this is when, if you see this, and it's interesting, because one of the concepts that they say, if a person wants to be kind, they should be a gardener. And we know with Ueshiba Sensei, he loved to be in the garden. He loved to plant crops. And actually, they sometimes, from what I understand, they had to pull him out of the garden to come into the dojo, because he was a farmer. He loved farming. He started farming communities in Hokkaido and everything. So that concept of being, the earth was where we connect to. And then there are three basic levels of humans classified according to the level of perfection that they have achieved. What is this level of perfection? They use the concept of wisdom in the East. And that wisdom doesn't mean information, which we think if we just get more information, we'll be wise. But actually, wisdom is the implementation of that said information into action. So when I was with my Buddhist teacher, if I talked too much about a philosophy, he would say, Kanjin, what is the point? Show me. And then if I couldn't demonstrate it he ignored what I had to say because all of it was just babble. So the three types of people, comes from Confucianism. The first is the standard person. That standard person is just seen as somebody being instinctual. Now, when they say instinctual, you would think instinctual is a good thing, but actually what they're talking about is somebody who is instinctual based on their ego or ignorance. So usually it's about I or self, right? So they can't see the relationship between others, which means empathy, right? And we think of humanity, we think of empathy. So to be a fully functioning human, we have to be able to have empathy or be able to see or be into other people's shoes. The second is a superior person. That is somebody who's cultivated and refined. So in Confucianism, that was somebody who practiced and studied the traditions and understood all of the books and wisdom, and were able to be able to follow them, just follow them. So that's why in Japan, if you look at it, form is very important. People call it a nation of nitpickers, because form was seen as the idea of Confucianism is seen as the interaction between humans, social aspect of enlightenment, how to enlighten to socially behave or interact with others. So the refined or man worthy of honor or person worthy of honor was somebody who understood those concepts and were able to implement them. Hence, propriety takes precedence over the individual in Japan or in Asia. And then the last one is the sage, who is in harmony with heaven and the way. So again, it's interesting, in Japan, Budoka are seen as somewhat strange, eccentrics in a way, but yet they're respected. That is the idea of the sage. So there's an old saying in Confucianism that what the sage sees as good, regular people see as bad. What regular people see as good, the sage sees as evil. That means there's a certain level of mentality involved in that. And we can see through the refinement of Aikido that one was able to not just simply follow propriety and form, but be able, and not just to simply be instinctual, but to be able to be that in harmony with heaven and earth, and then to be able to influence earth to maintain this harmony. And Ueshiba Sensei said, in every movement of Aikido, as we study our natural relationship, we see our relationship with both of these things. So sometimes I think we get a little nearsighted or narrow-minded when people simply think the act of practicing in the dojo is this manifestation or the sacred dance of Aikido. But in that aspect too, because as a Westerner, we may want to understand too much. Whereas people who don't understand, that's why they just follow propriety. And that's why all of these teachings are in every movement, such as one's cushion, the coin, how one sits on the floor, how one eats, how one speaks, how one conserves energy, how one interacts with others. This was seen as the form, the movement that brought forth this perfection. So with that idea of form, we can express that in Aikido, but we can also express that in meditation. So at this time, I'd like to bring that idea of meditation into this concept. So meditation, there are many types of meditation, and they all have different purposes. So many people think meditation is just meditation, but it's actually not. There are many purposes of meditation. So Shikan meditation is stopping and seeing. So stopping and seeing is, what does that mean? Shikan. Stopping means, as we are talking about the three types of humans, means stopping and not being driven by simple instincts, but gaining insight into one's true state of mind. And I think it's essential for people to understand Aikido is a basis in meditation, because meditation is a great place to start. And then once you practice meditation, you can see how it works into Aikido, because there are many forms of meditation or how they express, such as in Tiantai Buddhism, which is where the Maka Shikan comes from, where Shikan meditation comes from. There are many styles, such as you see in yoga, because yoga, asana, is the preparation for meditation. So the asana is preparing the body for meditation. Same as what we do with Aikido. It is a moving yoga where we incorporate our purifying, first our ethics, we regulate our body, we prepare our body, we regulate our breathing, right? Then we regulate our mind. And that beginning of the regulation of the body, mind, and spirit, that those concepts are what's stopping the mind because to see as it is. And then the insight is the observance. So this again is dealing with the concept of instinct, the idea of thinking, and then going beyond into a spiritual realm. So we'll just take a moment. So if you can sit straight, I'm going to share the basic concept of meditation. And again, please incorporate this into practice of Aikido. There are 3 states of meditation. One is entering, abiding, and emerging. So most people think you just sit and shut up, right? But actually there's an entrance, there's a abiding, and there is an emerging part. So we have a few minutes, so I'm going to go through just a basic concept of Shikan meditation. So even as you think about Zen meditation is a form that comes from Shikan meditation. It focuses on the shi, the stopping. So with Shikan meditation, what makes it a little different is that first we use regulation. So the basic idea is watching the breath. That is what we see in most meditation. But the idea is also the strength of the breath, the sound of the breath, being aware of how we breathe, because that naturally affects our state, our mind. So as we enter into meditation, one concept is to think of the body as a stone anchor. So we don't want to move our body. So let us close our eyes. And the first are 3 purifying breaths. So we breathe in through our nose and exhale through our mouth 3 times. And with that, you visualize removing all of the impurities from your body out. And then we sit in quiet, solitude. Now, again, people think you have to sit 30, 40 minutes, but we don't. We can sit very short amount of time, but we have to do the 3. Okay, so let us begin. So let us breathe in through your nose. Exhale through your mouth from all corners of your body. Two more times. Last time. Okay, now your eyes should be closed just enough to keep the light out. Your tongue, your teeth closed gently. Your tongue behind the upper teeth, be on the roof of your mouth. Gently relax your face, and then we breathe through our nose. Now, as we breathe in, we see that we're breathing in, we feel the coldness or the sensitivity on the nose as the air comes in, the coolness of the air. Then as we exhale through our nose, you can use a mantra or you can use the counting. The basic counting is counting 1 for each exhale up to 10 and then beginning again. If you lose your count, please begin again at 1. And we'll just do this for a few minutes. And as you are abiding within your meditation, watch your breathing, that you are not breathing too hard nor too soft, nor too quick nor too slow. But find a natural rhythm where they are equal, both your inhalation and exhalation. Now, as you breathe out, focus your mind on the exhalation, counting one or whichever number you're at. And then on the inhalation, we will do kan, which means to simply observe. So we do not count on the inhalation, we simply watch and feel the coolness of the breath as it comes through the nose. Shikan. Next, I would like you to emerge by simply, before we move our body, we release our concentration. So there is a kind of awareness that we release. So the feeling that you have of deep concentration during meditation, you then release it. Start moving your toes, your fingers, your body. Also, they rub the body to bring it to awareness. Rub your hands together, quickly generating heat. Place them over your eyes and slowly allow the light to come by removing your hands. So you may say this is a very short meditation, but actually meditation, as long as it is consistent, is very important. So it can be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but consistency is very important, that we practice and understand how and when we practice during the day or evening, that we have this mindset. So there is some teaching within these three aspects that when most people practice Aikido, they practice extremely passive. They simply are going through the movements. And again, as a beginner, that's where the idea of confusion is. That's the idea of entering. But then once we understand the kihon, or the form, we should then make our mind the idea of a concentrated mind. So we should have a different experience, both with our body, our breathing, our mind, our perception, our awareness. And then because Aikido is a spiritual practice, that as we emerge from it, we emerge with this idea of, and the founder always talks about the idea of purification, or misubi, the idea that then we feel connected with these aspects that we were trying to relate at the beginning of the lecture. So experiential Aikido is a way to experientially understand the divine with one's body, because our body is our tool to connect us both to the earth, that which we have influence, and of course connects us to heaven. So if you want to understand the true nature of heaven, if you want to understand the connection to the earth, that is done through one's one's body. through that harmony of yin yo or yin yang that is exemplified in Aikido. So when people are looking for peace and looking for balance, as everyone is talking in books talking balance, how to find balance, where to find balance. Balance is a very practical thing that we can experience. And Aikido lends it and allows us to understand it experientially rather than just simply in one's mind or with one's body, which are both disconnected. We want to bring them connected. So, all right. So I think it's just about time. I wish I had more time. Good.
Next week, we have next week with you.
Yeah, thank you.
We can always make more in the future too.
Yeah, well, one of the things is I'm trying to work with, and that's why I appreciate this opportunity, is I see how it changed my life, because I believe very much so that one's perception and outlook on the world really influences our minds. So there is a modern idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, that one's outlook, by changing one's philosophy, one's outlook about life, one's perception of life can change one's, how do you say, behavior, one's outcomes in one's life, how one sees life, how one interacts with others. And it's an important form of therapy that they use and have been growing through cognitive behavioral therapy. So that's another thing that people change. The third generation of cognitive behavioral therapy is very much based on the idea of meditation and shikan. So, yeah, I hope I was able to impart something. Just
Does anybody have any questions for Kanjin Sensei? Or any feedback, anything?
no,
Great.
I really appreciate what you taught today. I practice originally Tomiki Aikido, but I've practiced Aikikai as well. And I also practice the Aido and started Kendo even here a while back. But I also practiced for many years in the Bay Area Kyudo, specifically as a moving meditation.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed what you had to say, because that gives me maybe a deeper sense of those practices incorporate, meditation and then practice and then meditation is a part of that. But I think I can maybe practice a little more vigorously, I guess, or
I think, with somebody who's practiced and has the amount of experiential understanding, one of the challenges was you understand, you studied Kyudo and studied Kendo. Those are all ways of Michi, right? Ways of life. They all give us some insight. I believe what the Buddha said, they're expedients. And that always they seem kind of disjointed, because even the philosophies can seem different, okay, this is modern, this is old, whatever. But actually it's really fascinating because they're all based in the same. There's an interesting way of people, like how they look at Buddhism. So when you hear Buddhism in the modern times, they use the word Bukkyo. And Bu is a Buddha, but Kyo is a teaching, like educational teaching. But actually in the ancient time, before modernization of Japan, they called it Butsudo, which of course is the same do as Judo, Michi, which meant a path as compared to an educational pursuit. So I believe that meditation is the core to being able to actualize and bring all of those experiences together. Because when you do EI, when you do Kyudo, when you do anything, prayer, meditation, those are expressions of one's awareness of this interconnectedness. That's why with Ueshiba Sensei, you see him reciting Norito, the prayers for Shintoism. where we as the West would say, okay, that is a religious action, but actually it wasn't. It was that expression, which Aikido is an expression of one's understanding, which, as it says, is the sage, or as the, how do you say, the cultured person. That's the idea of in Confucianism and in the East, one demonstrates it through one's morality, through one's action, through one's every movement. And that's why if you look at form in East, that is the most important expression of the path for people to enter the path. But then it becomes formless after, because it's an internal thing. It has no form. But for us to perceive it, because what's the only thing that has form? Sky doesn't have form. Earth has form. That is why we have that connection with Earth. We have to enter into the divine through form. But then we can understand and perceive our connection to formlessness as well, which in Buddhism they call the middle way. But again, it's covered in all the basic spirituality of the East, and that's why they were able to become kind of synergistic. And that's why next time I was going to talk about this concept of the idea of the kami and the Buddhas coming together, and this idea of the synergy that seems to happen in the East, which is actually a big part of Aikido. Because if you read Ueshiba Sensei's writings, you know, as a person, you would have been educated in the ancient text of Confucianism. Even up to 100 years ago, you would memorize those poems, just like we memorize Shakespeare, right? Then you would understand within your daily life how yin and yang works in every aspect of how you hold the teapot, how you pour tea. The whole idea of channel yu, everything is based on yin yang, because that's our expression. It's how we manifest it in a dualistic, how do you say, dualistic form. That's how we express, because we're a dualism in that way, but we express it in this through this concept of yin and yang, and we can express it because that's easier to understand than formlessness, because we can't really comprehend that. That's why Aikido is based on the earth. We practice Aikido on the earth, but yet it connects us to the heavens. That's why form and that is essential, but also the idea of expression is the highest level of Aikido, which I believe is why we do Randori. Randori is that expression of formlessness. Form. But then we, through this interaction, we create this dance, which is the creation in every moment. They call that actually, Ueshiba Sensei, it's an ancient teaching called Ichinen Sanzen, which means 10,000 existences contained in a single moment. Everything is contained in one moment. And in that moment is where creation is found each moment. This idea of this fluctuation of nature of existence. Not the idea of a beginning and end, but this kind of fluctuation and movement in and out of itself, you know. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes.
It was amazing.
Mm.
We will
Really
continue
amazing.
this next week, same time, 6 p.m. Next week, Thursday, September 9th, 6 p.m. Pacific time. Please come back if you're interested. And Kanjin Sensei, thank you so much
Thank you very
for
much.
your time and for sharing your experiences and your thoughts with us. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Stop the recording.